As some of you know, I've been playing World of Warcraft for many years now, a little bit over 10 if I remember correctly, and I've been an officer, a guild leader, and a raid leader for vast majority of my playtime. Today I will talk about raid preparation and low population realms because when you're on a low populated realm, stuff works just slightly differently than when you are on a high populated realm, especially when you're trying to do progress on mythic raid content. Now, over the years, the population has changed quite significantly, and by that I don't mean necessarily capacities and amounts of people, but the way people perceive things and the way raids are done. Now, raids are significantly more difficult than they used to be in terms of individual level of play that is required to execute boss mechanics and how many boss mechanics there are on a significant boss fight. Now, a lot of people have been raiding continuously, both in our guild and other guilds, obviously, since several expansions ago, and not all of them have actually kept up with the way that you need to prepare, because the way we used to prepare for boss fights was significantly less intricate and way less demanding than it is today. Now, I don't mean that in a way that you have to farm more than you used to have to, because that's not true. Usually today it's much easier to get materials for raiding, but the preparation that is required to um, maximize your damage output, to have a good working strategy for individual boss fight, and so that you know what's gonna happen. Now that's the part where a lot of players today fail to prepare good enough. Now, what most players do these days, or well, they used to do back in the day, is they watched like a video and they read one guide or two guides possibly on written guides that explain the boss fight in some detail, right? Now, honestly speaking, the quality of video guides currently available for say Nighthold and Emerald Nightmare are not very high. And by that, I don't mean that there hasn't been enough effort put into them, because there was. It's just that the way things are explained aren't really useful from a perspective of a raid leader and potentially most average mythic raiders. Usually these days you get like one specific strategy that they decided for, or sometimes not even that, since the guides are usually not released before the instance is out, and you get descriptions of abilities and rough explanation on how to avoid them, but there is basically zero explanation on how those particular abilities might interact with each other, or how, or basically why you're doing something the way you're doing it. And this is something that has been very severely lacking for a long time. Now, in the past, when there were guides made, a lot of those guides used to have those little tips and tricks and small, minuscule details that made all the difference on beating the boss half faster than it is today. And and having those details meant that you basically were killing the bosses significantly faster. They don't do them in the guides anymore. So at some point, now you have to simply find other people from the guilds above you, or significantly above you, who are willing to talk to you and tell you about the little tips and tricks, so that you might waste less time overall on trying to figure it out on your own. And now you say, yeah, okay, this is not really necessary, but just because you're not competing for world first, that doesn't mean that people don't have ambitions to at least be first on their realms, or you know, want to kill the bosses in a decent amount of time. And then once you realize that there can be a very tiny minuscule thing that makes the fight significantly easier, that you just weren't aware about, it really feels annoying then if you wasted like 2 nights of raiding already and um, didn't figure that one out, and then you do, and then the boss dies like 10 minutes later, right? Which, at that point it shows like that the skill of a player and knowledge of individuals didn't really matter as much as one tactical tweak that made all the difference. And having those minor tips basically makes sometimes a difference between killing it, weak or even too faster than the competition, or simply saving a lot of time simply because you managed to handle a mechanic in a way that invalidates the mechanic completely. Now, on Odin, for example, you had that by using Blessing of Protection on the tanks on third, sixth, and ninth spears, for example, because during those spears you had the tank having to stack in a position but also run really far away. So both of those things become incompatible. So either tank has to run really far away in a direction where no one is standing, which due to limited space in last phase is slightly difficult to achieve but doable. Or alternatively, you just drop a blessing of protection on the tank and they can just run to their spot where they have to go, and that's it. Now, this might seem like a no-brainer, but it's not super obvious because, you know, these kind of interactions is something you have to figure out. Now, everyone knew about the blessing of protection trick, but if a guy just said, look, on third, sixth, and ninth spear, have blessing of protections up on the tank and explained why, because then they will be able to do the thing that I just explained, it would save like hundreds of guilds weeks of raiding or wiping on last phase because of that particular knowledge. The other thing is that the guides become too generic and they don't tell you about the specific assignments that they've done that could really help. Like, for example, sometimes on Odin, as another example, you could say, depending on your DPS, you could leave some melee DPS on Odin while Heimdall was up, so that you increase the damage output on Odin at the time, so that you had less overall add phases in that particular phase, second phase to be specific. And you know, for example, we ended up leaving 2 or 3 melee on the boss, and if that's a thing that they would tell you in the guide, again, you would consider it, and then based on your DPS, you would know that you could do that and adjust the numbers. But again, because it's not mentioned anywhere, you end up, having to figure out that on your own, and that's just time wasted. Now, I honestly don't believe they do this intentionally. It's just that most people making the guides don't realize what the difference of skill level and um, preparation there is between their players and players who are actually watching the guides and doing the fights. Now, people who end up doing the fights usually watch the guides and then end up being on those fights like weeks or even months after the people who actually made the guides, which ends up creating a chasm because, okay, yes, the players that are coming after them are generally speaking on a lower skill level. However, they are usually much better geared at that point than the players were when they were doing them originally when they were doing the guide, which means that a lot of the tactics that they said are no longer valid or are mostly inefficient. Now, some of the guides actually go back and end up updating the tactics if the tactic significance is huge, but some simply don't bother doing anything anymore, and you end up with a severely overgeared group doing a tactic that was built around severely undergeared group, and ultimately end up, you know, dredging through multiple phases of the fight or slowly executing the fight in a way that you could have skipped a lot of things if you just decided to burn the boss or redistribute DPS in a different manner because you'd end up having a significantly more. And this is why personal individual preparation is key aspect of being good in these fights, because if you prepare well, you as a player, individual player, not even raid leader, obviously raid leader has to prepare extra compared to everyone else, but um, on individual level, you might find some tips, trips, tactics that might help your guild if the raid leader is willing to listen to you, obviously, um, in beating the fights faster. Because when you're preparing properly, you are not only watching videos and reading the guides, you're also checking the logs of players who've already killed them. You are talking to players above you, and you know significantly more about the fight than the videos might offer. And you might notice specific things that you need to be aware of, and I'm gonna go over them right now in a moment. That what you should pay attention to when you're preparing for new fights. Okay? Alright, so here we go. The most important things to be aware of when you're preparing for fights. One, check several videos because they might use different tactics, and you might notice something on a different video that you didn't notice in the first one. Secondly, find multiple written guides or find a guide. Usually these days, Wowhead has really well written guides. Sometimes there's some mistakes, but we will leave that out of it for now. And scour the forums. You have Icy Veins, you have MMO Champion, you have Elite Jerks, you have a whole bunch of forums where people are discussing individual boss fights before they do them or even or after they do them, and you can get a whole bunch of little tips and tricks that might fine tune your ability to play and ultimately get you a boss kill 10, 20, 30, 40 pulls faster than you would have done it otherwise. Now, aside from that, as I already mentioned, Warcraft logs is the biggest and most important tool of all because guilds are logging, all of them pretty much, or every guild that is worth its salt is logging right now, and all of them are logging with advanced combat logging. This means that you can see every single person's gear, what they have, every rotation that they did when they casted any single spell. You can see when they procced, when they used cooldowns, either healing ones or DPS ones. You can even see how they moved during the fight, what positions they were taking, and you should extrapolate the information, try to figure out why they stood where they were standing and why they moved the way they did. How did they optimize their DPS to have higher numbers in certain phases? For example, you can, after one raid night, you can easily see if you are on a roughly the same item, roughly on the same item level as the guild that you were checking, where the discrepancies between DPS came. For example, if they managed to reach phase 2 half a minute faster than you did, you can see why they did it. They might have used heroism differently, cooldowns differently, they might have moved less than your specific tactic suggested, or you basically analyze why a guild A is doing better than your guild when when you have roughly the same gear level. Now, on low populated realms, you have an issue of these people being in guilds that are raiding mythics who aren't actually too willing to raid in the first place or don't even like the game. And the issue with that is that you end up with a player who's not preparing nearly as well as they should, and ultimately you have a very hard time replacing them. We are on our guild basically is currently on Sha'tar, Moonglade, and Steamwheel Cartel, and it's one of the smallest realms in the whole WoW universe. And ultimately, we can not recruit from cross-realm realms because no one wants to come to this shitty realm. That is a big problem because ultimately you end up not being able to replace the players that are not mentally on the same level as you are. And having mental discrepancy between raiders in the guild is one of the worst things that can happen to you. However, what you can do is bring up some players who haven't raided Mythic before at all and train them into becoming raiders that you want. Secondly, you can also rely quite heavily on people returning to the game because one of the things that low population realms do well is having players going on and off every couple of tiers. People, you know, disappear and then come back like a tier after or 2 tiers after or sometimes even later. And more often than not, players who used to be good at one point end up still being good years later as long as they, actually catch up with the knowledge and stuff. Now, as a raider or raid leader, I'm pretty sure you've been in a position before where someone is not prepared or not playing well enough and they start saying, "Oh, yeah, but this is just a game," and this even happens in mythic guilds on mythic progress. You know, we're standing in front of the last boss on the expansion and say, this is just a game, we are here to enjoy things, not to, stress over them. And at that point, you kindly notify them that, this is a mythic progress guild that, it is expected from them to prepare just like everyone else in the guild was expected and did prepare. And they still don't understand that by not preparing, they're not just affecting themselves, they are affecting the whole other raid. And at that point, you want to replace that person if you can, but sometimes it's just not possible. And then good players who have prepared either become more like that people and stop preparing quite as well, or end up leaving the game or leaving the guild to join another who more closely matches their mentality. And, you know, we're all aware of this issue, and still, no, very little can be done about it if you don't have a large enough recruitment pool to be able to keep getting players in who have similar mentality than you have. And the annoying part at that point is that those players, end up valuing their time more than your time. The players who didn't prepare in the first place, they think that their own time is more valuable than the time of every other person in the guild. And at that point, you want to get rid of that player as soon as possible because they don't understand what the guild and or you yourself as a raid leader or guild leader are trying to achieve. You really need to have every single person in the guild on the same mental level, on the same idea of what you're trying to achieve. As long as this isn't so, you will not be realm first and you will not have a chance to compete or achieve the goals that you set in front of yourself unless you drop the goals significantly. And basically, this is one of the main reasons why right now we are not the number one guild on the realm and another guild is because one, they are clearly capable. They always were, from what I could remember since the servers got merged, and they seemingly prepare pretty well. They have their tactics nailed down, and they execute them fairly well, clearly showing ability for vast majority of the guild to prepare on a higher level. And in comparison, our raids have been very touch and feel with a lot of time wasted on people who haven't prepared, having very long learning curves, requiring maybe even up to 10, 15 pulls to even realize what the hell is happening on a fight rather than, you know, fully understanding the fight inside out before the pull happens. Now, obviously, execution, DPS numbers, and everything else isn't expected to be the absolute perfect the moment the first pull happens. However, you know, you are expected to know what is going to happen next at any moment in the fight before the fight ever is pulled. And, if you push a new phase for the first time, you should know what is happening in the new phase rather than wiping immediately and having to have it explained to you the next time. So with that said, I'm just going to finish my monologue now, but basically, you know, prepare, read up, check all the sources of information that you can get. Talk to other people within your guilds or other people that are maybe not in your guild, but that you know that they are good players and that they have prepared for fights. Try to communicate to see if the other guilds are willing to share their tactics with you, or at the same time you should be willing to share your tactics with the other guilds, because if you're not competing for the world first, then you are competing, you know, for a kill to happen as fast as you possibly can. Because the faster you achieve the kills, the faster you reach the last boss, the less time you actually have to spend, you know, doing crazy things and wiping fights over and over and over. And the more time you can spend later on preparing for the next tier or the next expansion rather than, and then ending up being stuck on a boss fight like 3/4 into the instance and not being able to kill it because, you know, you reach your skill cap. All right. Thanks for listening and tune in next time when I'm going to talk about WoW.